Good afternoon and greetings to all respected viewers on this topic today. A special thanks to Burhan Al-Marifa for organizing the Saudi Legal Conference and for the SLC itself for inviting me to speak on this exciting topic, which is essentially international agreements between Saudi property owners and the international operators within the hospitality sector. Now, why is this an exciting topic in general? Well, obviously because of the transformation that the Saudi landscape is currently undertaking. From social to economical, which all leads to obviously changes in the legal sector. With all these massive giga projects, real estate developments across the various Saudi cities and regions, the hospitality sector itself is primed to change. So there's going to be a lot of interest from local developers, regional developers, and obviously foreign investors to enter the Saudi market and to help with the development of the sector and the economy in line with Vision 2030, of course. So we can always talk about the actual agreements itself that have to be entered into between the Saudi owners and the international operators, but the agreements itself are basically private agreements between the various parties. So obviously a variety of terms and conditions need to be adhered to, need to be negotiated. And those obviously take quite a while, especially between lawyers, between themselves, various comments here or there, agreements on assignment of liability, and so forth and so on. But in the end, what do the agreements actually typically talk about? I'm going to address this briefly because what I thought would be more interesting for all viewers today is actually to also discuss the requirements essentially of how international operators, specifically or hotel operators, including hotel apartment operators or a combination of both, can come and get licensed here in Saudi based on the new laws and regulations, which have become increasingly easier and more efficient. So in line, what do the agreements themselves deal with between the operators and the Saudi developers? We're talking about, a description of the hotel itself or the hotel apartment company itself, the operating term, the appointment and engagement of the operator, anything related to the hotel employees, the provision of funds, all the small corporate matters related to working capital, bank accounts, the keeping of budgets, records, management fees, and so forth. Of course, including the insurance and property taxes, who's responsible for repairs and maintenance, and various agreement on termination of agreement and who's liable if any damages occur, and so forth and so on. So those are the agreements, basically the commercial agreements between a hotel operator and a Saudi property owner or developer in relation to hospitality sector. Now, what's going to be interesting, other than licensing from, let's talk about foreign investors for a second, other than licensing from the Ministry of Investment of Saudi Arabia, MISA, and related, licensing and establishment requirements at the Ministry of Commerce, okay, which we'll get to a bit later. Okay, what is to obtain? Essentially, what's required is additional approvals and licenses from the Ministry of Tourism, or the MOT. Okay. So these are going to be issued in accordance with the tourism law and its implementing regulations, okay, which stipulates in part that no activity related to tourism accommodation facilities may be engaged to prior to obtaining a license from the MOT. And the tourism law does state that it does supersede the hotel law and repeals any of its conflicting provisions. Now, this was a couple of years ago, but there was a bit of confusion about that recently, about whether the hotel law was still valid or not. So essentially, the MOT has the licensing guide for tourism accommodation facilities. Okay, and this is issued by the Quality and Licensing Administration of the MOT. And it states that there are two levels of licensing approvals, essentially. Now, of course, all of this can be updated because with the various changes in the laws and regulations in the kingdom, there's going to be a variety of new laws and new regulations that may seek to streamline a lot of these requirements. However, at this point, there are two levels of licensing The first involves approval of the actual, development itself, the actual building that is planned to serve as the tourism accommodation facility. So we'll call that the initial approval, right? And the second involves licensing of the corporate entity itself that will carry out the operation and management of the tourism facility. So the hotel operator, which could be obviously in a lot of cases a foreign entity, like a lot of these 4-star and 5-star hotels are in the region and the country today. So the tourism law mentions that a licensee from the MOT is any natural or corporate person holding a valid license from the MOT to operate and manage tourism accommodation facilities and tourism-related services and professions in accordance with the provisions of the tourism law. And the executive regulations also expand on the above, and they indicate that the owner of the building or land in question, or the party that has leased the land in order to construct or operate the tourism facility, apply for the MOT license. So essentially, the lease agreement also between the owner and the operator of the facility must include the owner's approval to operate the building as a tourism accommodation facility. So this is an essential aspect of any international agreement or any agreement between the international operator and the Saudi developer, which is essentially that the owner and the operator must include in such an agreement the owner's express approval to operate the building as a tourism accommodation facility. And we note that obviously it's almost universal market practice in other jurisdictions for the building owner to be treated as the hotel operator for licensing purposes, okay? And the hotel operator to essentially, obtain licensing, but through the owner. So the MOT requires that the building where the hotel facilities are planned to be obviously undertaken conform to preset engineering and architectural design requirements and specification building design requirements. So obviously this includes safety and design elements that have to conform to the MOT's requirements. So the nature largely depends on the classification star rating desired, okay, for the hotel apartment project. So the hotel operator must apply for the initial approval from the MOT in order to obtain its approval that the design is considered acceptable for use as a hotel or a hotel apartment, whatever the case may be, within the respective classification star rating thought. So either 3-star, 4-star, 5-star, whatever the case may be. So the relevant application process, I can get into more detail about that, and I know it's a bit tedious, but these elements of law, obviously you gotta go through the different elements, and you gotta go through the different. It's not simply the elements, but even not simply the elements of the law, but even the what do you call it? If you want licensing processes and documents that are required. So what do you need? You need an MOT initial license to commence with submitting the below documentation to obtain the initial approval. So you need to complete the online application form, okay, within the MOT website, essentially requesting the initial approval and the classification star rating sought. So either 4 or 5-star, or whatever the case may be. You submit the relevant documentation or information requested in the online application form, including the separate registration within what's called the Shumus electronic system through its own website, right? So Shumus is essentially a central electronic system connected to the National Information Center at the Ministry of Interior. So you submit the original design, blueprints accredited by an engineering office. Then you submit the relevant land deed or the rental contract, allowing the applicant to utilize the building as a tourism accommodation facility. So should the Ministry of Tourism approve the application based on the above documents submitted, it'll issue the applicant with the initial approval. So now you have your initial approval, okay? So essentially we got the initial approval. Let me get back to the point where we got the initial approval from the Ministry of Tourism. So what are the requirements for the license itself? Okay, so subsequent to it. So following the issuance of this initial approval, the applicant will be provided 30 days to apply for and obtain the licenses from the other relevant authorities. Now, what are those other authorities? You're talking about the municipality and the civil defense authorities, essentially. So the application based on this is rejected, by the way. If this application is rejected by the Ministry of Tourism, the applicant is provided 60 days to submit an appeal. And if the appeal is rejected or not addressed by the MOT, then you may essentially anybody can submit a grievance to the Board of Grievances. Okay? Now, should the required municipality and civil defense licenses be granted, okay, following the initial approval, then you submit additional documentation to complete the process and officially obtain your MOT license. So that includes the municipality license, civil defense license, commercial registration certificate, trademark registration certificate, the national address of the hotel itself, the map of the hotel or the hotel apartment location, for example, like the land plot and the building, the room and service prices to be set by the hotel and to be committed for approximately a year. And any amendments must be notified to the MOT to that, because that's obviously important for the Ministry of Tourism to keep track of all of this. And then you pay the application fees and the license fees, okay? And thereafter, the applicant has to confirm that the building is furnished and ready to be utilized for the intended purposes. Okay, so whether it's a hotel or a hotel apartment or anything like that. Okay, so then the MOT will schedule inspection visits within approximately 7 days of the submission of the above documents. And if you receive no negative remarks or comments as a result of the inspection, then you will be notified within 30 days of the above documents submission. Thereafter, you have to submit additional documentation, of course, for the MOT to complete its due diligence. And that's undertaking that the information submitted is accurate, non-violation of relevant laws and regulations, okay? And you're not to amend the official address of the hotel, without informing or getting approval for the MOT. Not allow any other third parties to operate the hotel, because obviously the MOT is approving this specific application with this particular hotel operator. And the hotel owner obviously is to be approved by the Ministry of Commerce. Any financial guarantees required by the MOT must be provided. And you've got to join a qualification program for tourism accommodation management. So upon successful completion of all this, then the MOT license will be issued in the name of the applicant. So there you go, you get your initial approval and you got your final approval from the MOT. And again, all of this could change. There are obviously changes going on in all relevant ministries, again, to make processes simpler, more streamlined, and more efficient for international operators, as well as for local developers and regional developers. So now, if you're talking about the validity period and the time frame, okay, the MOT license is going to be valid for 3 years or so, and is renewable for similar periods. And subsequent to the issuance of the MOT license, then the applicant will also be issued a classification certificate specifying the star rating of the establishment, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star, whatever the case may be. Now, the time required to obtain these MOT licenses, assuming there's no rejections and not counting the time to obtain, the requisite municipal and civil defense licenses, because those obviously have their own time frames, approximately 4 to 6 weeks or so. Okay, and this is specifically from the MOT, and including the time required to schedule and complete the inspection visits. Now, what's also important when we're talking about the various giga projects for tourism, require a lot of tourism accommodation, hotels, hotel apartments, something that which is already known in the country and in the region, but not as much as in the West, for example, is, for example, timeshare. The concept of timeshare. Now, this will require ownership, or at least for part of the year or for a certain period of time. Now, timeshare is related to ownership. Therefore, ownership laws in Saudi Arabia have to be taken into serious consideration before any such schemes are put into place. So if we're talking about that, then let's discuss how those affect Saudi nationals and how those affect GCC nationals, and of course foreign nationals, and specifically if, and in timeshare situations, for example, if you own a piece of property for a certain time, perhaps you would like to lease it for other periods of time where you may not be utilizing the property, where the foreign investor might be abroad, for example, or the foreign national might be abroad. So leasing becomes an important aspect as well. Can you lease such properties if you actually own them? So for Saudi nationals to commence with, either Saudi nationals or corporate entities are of course entitled to own any aspect of tourism facilities, either the property itself, obviously, or specific units, if we're talking about hotel apartments, okay? And assuming, of course, they obtain the relevant MOT approvals and licenses and other licenses relevant in cases of corporate entities. For example, CRs, allowance activities and whatnot, okay? Now, individuals may also lease them, and corporate entities may lease them to any third parties entitled to own such units or to lease such units in the country. So for Saudi nationals, it's pretty straightforward and it's pretty easy, and there's no large headaches there. As far as GCC nationals and entities, okay, so pure Gulf citizens or entities that are owned purely by GCC nationals. The ultimate share owners are GCC nationals. So although real estate investment in the city of Mecca and Medina is obviously prohibited activity for any party other than KSA nationals, okay, GCC ownership law does entitle GCC nationals and wholly owned GCC entities to acquire and to lease property in other areas of Saudi Arabia. So GCC nationals and entities are entitled to own hotel apartment units, for example. You know what I mean? Assuming they obtain the relevant, again, MOT approvals and licenses, and in the case of corporate entities, possess the other relevant licenses, CRs from the MOC, allowing real estate ownership and investment. And GCC individuals are also entitled to lease property to any other third parties entitled under the KSA regulations to own such units. Now, with foreign nationals and entities, that becomes a bit trickier, and this is where obviously some laws are being amended in order to facilitate this, but in the end, the law right now stands as follows. So, for foreign nationals, okay, non-GCC nationals and corporate entities, all right, the relevant KSA regulations treat these quite differently. So, you're taking a look at the regulations of real estate ownership and investment by non-Saudis, okay, the foreign ownership law, let's call it. So they state that foreigners may own property in Saudi Arabia, but only if the respective individual possesses a valid residence permit, so very common, all right, has a permit from the Ministry of Interior, and only if the property is to be utilized solely as a residence. So at this stage, the foreign national may not utilize the purchased property for investment purposes, for the most part, okay? So any foreign individual, third-party purchaser, let's say, may not own property that are designated as, for example, hotel apartments, okay, and lease it to any other party. So as an individual, you cannot do that as a foreigner. Now, there are exceptions, obviously, with the golden visa, for example. Now, this would allow such leasing, since there are special requirements there that allow foreign nationals to, under certain elements and under certain assumptions, be treated as Saudi nationals for purposes of economic activity and commercial activity. Okay, so now foreign corporate entities, okay, the foreign ownership law does allow them to own real estate for investment purposes. Okay, foreign entities, so companies and so forth, and that obviously would allow them to own hotel apartment units, for example, or any other units in tourism-related facilities that are open for foreign ownership. Okay, but they're subject to possessing relevant licenses. So the licenses you need, the first and most important one is obviously the MISA, foreign investment license, and an MOC commercial registration certificate. So in order to acquire property for investment purposes, such as, again, hotel apartment units, timeshare units, or whatnot, this first requires a property ownership service license from MISA. Okay. So, and of course, this licensing that the company is required to conduct its own business activities and operations in Saudi. Okay, so a company cannot simply come into Saudi simply to own. It's got to be conducting other activity, and then it is allowed to own other units, but not as its primary or main activity. All right. So MISA allows foreign national ownership to own property for the following purposes, and it lists four at this stage, which is private housing, headquarters for an industrial entity, administrative headquarters or residence for company employees, and for warehousing purposes. Okay, so the related MISA-imposed property ownership associated with the license include the following. Okay, so this is ownership conditions. The property must be outside Mecca and Medina, because obviously that's only reserved for Saudi ownership. The capital of the company, but must not be less than the value of the property to be purchased. The area of the property's location must be within the perimeter of the immediate need of the company. Okay? And the company operations must be active, and the company must have committed no violation of the foreign investment law. And the applicant has to follow up with the Ministry of Justice following MISA approval afterwards for the decision for issuance of its decision. And the validity of the letter addressed to the notary and the Ministry of Justice will be approximately 6 months. Okay, so there is a longer process, obviously, than when compared to KSA nationals and GCC nationals. So, essentially, what documents are required by MISA in order to apply for this license? You need a letter from the entity or a shareholders resolution, essentially requesting ownership, stating the purpose of the ownership, and in relation to the land or the property, the lot number, the deed number, the date of the deed, and it's got to be authenticated by the Chamber of Commerce. So it's got to be a company. And then you need a copy of the property deed and a copy of the relevant municipality permit to build, or an approval letter essentially from the municipality indicating the type of use of the land to be owned. Okay? So MISA indicates that if approved, this license can be issued in approximately 2 days, which is great on behalf of MISA. MISA has actually shown itself to be extremely efficient in recent years. The date of the relevant application, essentially 2 days from the date of the relevant application. And there are no MISA fees in connection with this part of the application for the license. So after this license, all right, which is the property ownership service license, as MISA calls it, then you apply for the MISA property investment license. All right. So essentially, this license is only available for entities that possess a property license and want to undertake a property investment transaction in Saudi Arabia. So historically, a license of this nature was intended to authorize real estate development, okay? And it would permit investment within the wider meaning of a hotel-like arrangement, okay? Or a rental pool structure, so to speak. So again, if a tourism facility allows ownership of units or opens it to potential buyers or purchasers, then such would be allowed, all right? Even for foreign investors, as long as you go through this licensing process. So, the related MISA property ownership conditions associated with the license include the following. The cost of the project, the investment project, must not be less than 30 million riyals. Now, 30 million riyals includes the land and the building cost. The building, again, must be outside Mecca and Medina. The applicant, again, has to follow up with the Ministry of Justice following MISA's approval of the licensing. Okay? And the validity letter addressed to the notary shall be approximately 6 months. Okay? And then again, relevant documentations to be submitted is a letter from the company itself that's applying to own a property. Okay, so a shareholders resolution requesting ownership. Okay, and again, identifying lot number, deed number, date of the deed, all authenticated by the Chamber of Commerce. Owner's preliminary approval. Okay, and not a final sales contract. Owner's preliminary approval to transfer the property ownership to the company's name. Again, indicating the lot number, deed number, and so forth. A report from a local engineering office approved by the Saudi Council of Engineers, indicating the total cost of the project. And concerning investments in land, commitment to utilize the land for the specified purpose within a period of 5 years. So again, MISA indicates that the above license, if approved, can also be issued in approximately 2 days. So which is great. And again speaks to the efficiency of that ministry. Now, if hotel apartments are an issue, okay, and that may be an issue actually for ownership requirements again. So tourism facilities are mostly, people think of the hotel and you go and you rent a hotel room and so forth. But again, we've been talking about ownership because ownership may be a big part, may play a big part in Vision 2030 and the attraction of foreign nationals, not to mention obviously KSA nationals and to come and acquire property in some of these giga projects that are being developed and that are, quite exciting on the Saudi landscape, like the Red Sea property, Amala, obviously Niyum. All of those are going to obviously potentially have their own laws and regulations, which are being developed related to ownership and investment. However, at this stage, this is what is applicable and is obviously subject to amendments, but it's becoming more and more efficient, which is a plus. So if, for example, the question of leasing arises, because if a foreign national or a local acquires a property and wants to lease it as part of his investment plans or business plans, then leasing becomes an issue. So who's allowed to lease? Now, we touched on that a bit earlier, but as stated, the nationals, okay, Saudi nationals, okay, corporate entities legally allowed to own such hotel apartment units, let's call it, in Saudi, may subsequently also lease them, according to to other nationals or corporate entities that are allowed to own, okay, or lease such units in Saudi Arabia. So the GCC ownership law and the foreign ownership law do not contradict this statement. So in that sense, there's nothing wrong with leasing, all right? And in addition, MISA, the MOC, and the Ministry of Tourism have indicated that they do not have any objection to such leases being entered into in practice by the relevant parties involved in the transactions, and nor do they have any reservations or restrictions concerning the term of the leases, okay? Essentially, the ministries regard these terms as commercial in nature and to be agreed upon between the respective lessor and the lessee. Now, what's important as well is, let's say leases are entered into, right? So what would make them legally binding, all right, other than the agreement itself? Viewers are asked to remember that, of course, now Saudi Arabia implements the IJAR registration system. IJAR is essentially a leasing service network designed, to organize the relationship between the leasing parties, namely the tenant, the landlord, the real estate broker. All right, and it applies to both residential and commercial units. And the leases at issue, to the hotel operator, for example, third-party purchasers to the developer are required to be registered on the IJAR system, licensed real estate broker. Okay, so this gives a general overview of the ownership, leasing requirements for Saudi, GCC, and foreign nationals in Saudi Arabia. All right. Obviously, the agreements, like we talked about before, are commercial understandings between the parties. All right. Most important is that they abide by the Ministry of Tourism requirements. Okay, and we can actually expect a lot of changes to come on the Ministry of Tourism platforms, for example, and requirements, which will in turn potentially amend requirements or ownership, property ownership, leasing, and ownership requirements at the Ministry of Investment and the Ministry of Commerce. Given the large amount of real estate development projects, both in Saudi cities and in the new projects and tourism projects being developed throughout the country. So I hope this gives a good overview of the rights of various parties. I thank you all for your time and your kind attention. Happy to answer any questions anybody may have or to further develop anything and anything we touched upon today. Okay, so I see we have a couple of questions. Okay, how can losses be reduced for hotel workers? So in terms of contracts concluded before the pandemic. Now this obviously is more labor related. This type of question is more labor related, but essentially it would depend on a variety of factors. If the hotel workers, for example, first of all, we need to take a look at the specific terms of the employment agreement of the specific worker at issue. And at the same time, if before the pandemic and the pandemic issues were not affected, because as you know, during the pandemic, a lot of laws were either put on hold or amended, or put into place, labor requirements or labor laws, in order to obviously facilitate, especially the workers' plight during the pandemic. So losses, not exactly sure what specific losses are being referred to, but if we're talking about losses as far as wages and so forth and so on, of course there are that take up such matters at the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development, and those can be raised if there's a conflict between the employer and the employee. Or at the same time, if you have a specific grievance that's not pandemic related, okay, you can always go back to the labor law, and that specifically addresses it, whether it falls into any requirements regarding end of service or any types of conditions whereby the end of service is not being honored for any specific reason. All of that can be addressed, but it just depends on the specific type of loss. So if there's no more questions, I'm very happy that I'm very happy to have spoken today on this exciting platform. Thank you again for the Saudi Legal Conference for inviting me. I hope this was informational, and I hope to be able to actually speak at a later stage in order to further develop, or to further enlighten the Saudi market and foreign investors on the new laws and regulations that have come out on the giga projects involved, and at the same time within the ministries, especially the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Investment, to facilitate foreign ownership and regulations in the country as part of Vision 2030. So I thank you again for everybody. If there's no more questions, and God bless.